The transport ship descended through purple clouds toward the colony world, designated as Outpost 7, and Sophie Martinez pressed her face against the small window to watch the landing. She had traveled 3 months through space to reach this remote terraforming station, and her excitement had not faded even slightly during the long journey. Sophie was 28 years old with brown hair tied back in a practical ponytail and wore the standard green uniform of the Botanical Corps. Her job was simple in theory but difficult in practice. She would take barren worlds and make them bloom with life. She carried seeds and soil samples and knowledge passed down through generations of farmers and scientists. Most importantly, she carried something that many alien species found baffling. She carried hope. The landing was smooth, and Sophie gathered her equipment bags before heading down the ramp. The air outside was thin but breathable and smelled like metal and stone. The landscape stretched out in shades of gray and brown, with rocky hills rising in the distance. A few prefabricated buildings clustered together near the landing pad, and that was the extent of human civilization on this world. A figure waited near the largest building, and Sophie walked toward it with her bag slung over both shoulders. As she got closer, she realized with a start that the figure was not human at all. The being stood nearly 7 feet tall with a slender body covered in smooth chitin that shimmered with an opalescent quality. 4 arms hung at its sides, and its head was elegant and angular with large, multifaceted eyes that caught the light like jewels. 2 delicate antennae curved back from its forehead and moved slightly as if tasting the air. Sophie had seen images of the Nashiri before, but meeting one in person took her breath away. They were beautiful in an otherworldly way that made her think of living sculptures. The Nashiri stepped forward, and when she spoke, her voice had a musical quality with harmonics that seemed to resonate in multiple frequencies at once. A small translator device on her collar converted the sounds into standard English. "My name is Zimara, and I am the xenobiology specialist assigned to this station. You must be Sophie Martinez." Sophie smiled and extended her hand, then remembered that the Nashiri might not understand the gesture. She let her hand drop and nodded instead. "Yes, that is me, and I am very happy to meet you. I have read about your species and your world. I am sorry about what is happening to your star." Zimara's antennae drooped slightly and her large eyes seemed to dim. "It is the way of things. Stars die and species end. We have accepted this truth." She paused and tilted her head in a way that reminded Sophie of a curious bird. "I do not understand why your people waste resources on projects like this terraforming station, when entropy will claim everything eventually." Sophie felt a familiar stubbornness rise in her chest. "Because we can. Because while we are alive, we should make things grow and help others. Because giving up is not in our nature." Zimara made a sound that the translator rendered as thoughtful humming. "I have much to learn about humans, it seems. Come and I will show you to your workspace." The next several days passed in a blur of activity as Sophie unpacked her equipment and surveyed the soil conditions on the planet. The ground was poor and lacked the organic compounds needed for most plant life, but Sophie had dealt with worse. She set up hydroponic growing stations and began germinating seeds from dozens of different earth plants that had been engineered for harsh conditions. Zimara visited the greenhouse every day and watched Sophie work with what seemed like fascination mixed with confusion. The Nashiri scientist asked endless questions about why Sophie bothered to nurture such fragile life forms when the statistical probability of long-term success was low. Sophie always answered the same way. "Because they deserve a chance to live. Because maybe they will surprise us. Because hope is not about statistics." On the 8th day, Zimara brought Sophie a gift. It was a small crystalline container, holding a handful of seeds that looked like tiny spirals of purple and silver. "These are from my homeworld. They are called Sivanash, which means last light in your language. They were once common in the gardens of my people, but now they grow only in controlled environments. Our cold has killed most natural plant life." Sophie accepted the container with reverence and held it up to the light. The seeds sparkled like tiny galaxies. "They are beautiful. Will you teach me how to grow them?" Zimara's antennae drooped again. "There is no point. They require specific conditions that exist only on Nashiri. Our star is dying and grows colder each cycle. In perhaps 200 of your years, it will no longer sustain our world. My people have made peace with extinction. We record our history and culture so that something will remain when we are gone." Sophie felt anger and sadness twist together in her chest. 200 years is a long time. Your people could evacuate or find new worlds or adapt. We are not like humans. We do not rage against the inevitable. We accept our place in the cycle of existence. Sophie set the container down carefully and looked directly into Zimara's multifaceted eyes. My ancestors came from a world that almost killed them many times. Ice ages and droughts and plagues and wars. We almost went extinct a dozen times over. But we are still here because we are too stubborn to die quietly. Let me try to help your people. Let me see if I can make these seeds grow in conditions they were not meant for. Zimara was silent for a long moment and her antennae trembled slightly. Why would you do this? My people are nothing to you. Sophie reached out slowly and gently touched one of Zimara's 4 hands. Because you are standing in front of me right now. Because I can try. Because that is what humans do. Something shifted in Zimara's expression, and though Sophie could not read alien emotions well, she thought she saw the beginning of hope flickering there like a candle flame in darkness. The work began in earnest after that. Sophie studied the Siva-Nash seeds and researched Nashiri atmospheric conditions and light spectrums and soil composition. She worked 18-hour days and filled notebooks with calculations and experimental protocols. Zimara helped by providing detailed information about her homeworld, and together they built a specialized growing chamber that could simulate Nashiri conditions. The first batch of seeds failed to germinate. The second batch sprouted but died within days. The third batch grew pale and twisted before withering away. Sophie refused to give up. She adjusted mineral balances and light wavelengths and temperature fluctuations. She crossbred the Siva-Nash with hardy earth mosses to create hybrid vigor. She talked to the seeds as she worked because her grandmother had always said that plants grew better when they knew someone cared about them. Zimara watched all of this with growing amazement. She had never seen someone fight so hard for something with such low probability of success. She began to understand that humans possessed a kind of madness that was also a kind of magic. They believed they could change the unchangeable simply by refusing to accept defeat. On the 43rd day, Sophie called Zimara to the greenhouse with urgency in her voice. When the Nashiri scientist arrived, she found Sophie standing in front of the specialized growing chamber with tears streaming down her face and a huge smile on her lips. Look. Just look. Inside the chamber, a dozen tiny plants pushed up through the soil. They were small and fragile, but undeniably alive. The leaves unfurled in spirals of purple and silver that caught the artificial light and seemed to glow from within. Zimara made a sound that the translator could not render. She pressed all 4 hands against the chamber glass, and her antennae stood straight up, in what Sophie had learned was a sign of intense emotion. They live. They actually live. Sophie wiped her eyes and laughed. They do. And if they can live here, they can live on your world too. We can engineer them to survive colder temperatures and lower light levels. We can save them, Zimara. We can save your world's plants, but our star is still dying. Then we buy time. We keep your world alive long enough to find other solutions. Maybe your people relocate. Maybe we find a way to reignite your star. Maybe something we cannot imagine yet. But we do not give up. Zimara turned to look at Sophie, and in her alien eyes there was something new. Something that had not existed there before. It was the tiniest spark of defiance against fate. It was the beginning of human stubbornness taking root in an alien heart. Over the following months, the work continued and expanded. Sophie and Zimara sent reports back to both human and Nashiri authorities. The response was skeptical at first, but as evidence mounted that the hybrid plants could survive in extreme cold conditions, more resources were allocated to the project. Other scientists joined the effort, both human and Nashiri, working together to preserve a dying world's ecology. Sophie taught Zimara everything she knew about gardening and agriculture and ecological restoration. She shared stories about Earth's history and the countless times humans had brought species back from the brink of extinction. She explained about seed banks and genetic preservation and rewilding programs. Most importantly, she taught Zimara that accepting death was different from welcoming it, and that fighting for survival was not futile even when victory was uncertain. Zimara in turn taught Sophie about Nashiri philosophy and art and the strange beauty of a culture that had made peace with its own ending. She showed Sophie recordings of her homeworld with its crystalline,